Why did I choose Hopkins? I've had a relationship with Hopkins for 40 years. When I was a senior at Manhattan College, I was given Hopkins to present a class on, and so I was supposed to talk about the Wreck of the Deutschland. Hopkins was brand new to me, but reading it, I fell in love with him. I fell in love with the language. To tell you the truth, I also fell in love with him because I'm from a working class background, the oldest of 7 children, Roman Catholic, and there were very few Catholic writers, Catholic poets that I could identify with. I mean, there was Ezra Pound, there was T.S. Eliot I was reading, Mariani Moore, Hart Crane, but Hopkins could speak to me on another level. He could speak to me in terms of that Catholic vision, sacramental vision, and he was intelligent, and he was a groundbreaker. He was developing a new kind of poetry, and so he became a fascinating subject for me. And I went from there. When I went off for my PhD, I came up with different ideas to write my dissertation on, and each one the director would put the kibosh on, and then finally I came up with Hopkins, and she said, do it. She said, you're the person to do the Hopkins. And so I did my dissertation on Hopkins, and that was published as a commentary on the complete poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins by Cornell University Press just before my 30th birthday. That book came out. So I was kind of, I had this very special love for Hopkins. I had done just the sonnets for my dissertation, and they said, well, if you want to do a book, you're going to have to do all the poetry. And so I went back and I explicated all of it in this commentary. Went on to do other biographies of other figures, but I wanted always to come back to Hopkins and to do a full biography. And so after having done biographies of William Carlos Williams and John Berryman and Robert Lowell and then Hart Crane, and being at Boston College and also having a son who's a Jesuit priest, I wanted to come back again to Hopkins, and so we're better than right here at Boston College to finally come back to it and to write it. So that's how it happened. Well, you know, it's funny. As I wrote the relationship between Hopkins and the other poets, well, I'm also a poet, and I learned a lot from Hopkins. I learned a lot about language. I learned a lot about form. But I also learned something about the nature of writing about the sacred from Hopkins. When I went on, I went back to Williams, or took up Williams for 10 years, because I was also interested in the American idiom. And Williams himself had been fascinated with what James Joyce had done to the English language, for the English language, as an Irishman. After all, he was speaking English, but he made it his own language. And Williams was fascinated by that idea. He said, you know, well, what about Americans? Americans aren't Brits, after all. We have our own language, and you know, and what I speak here in New Jersey is not the way they speak in Manchester or in London, you know, or Dublin for that matter. So Williams wanted to do for the American scene what he saw James Joyce having done for the Irish scene. And then, so I learned a lot about Williams. I was fascinated because my mother and grandmother are both from New Jersey. They're both from the Paterson area. And I wanted to get the American idiom down. So I had Hopkins on the one hand, who's working with a kind of extended language, elevated, at times complex, very much in the Welsh tradition, Cwngyth, Dylan Thomas's Welsh. Williams is much more, in a sense, final, broad. It's not a flowery language. It's pretty much straightforward. This is the way things are. But how do you take that language and then lift it to the level of the poetic imagination? And I was fascinated how Williams was able to do that. So then there was Williams, and I learned from Williams. I went on to Berryman, because Berryman could turn an idea on a dime. He could within say 16 lines, he could switch into 3 or 4 voices. I said, how did he do that? How did he keep moving from the voice of a professor, say, to the voice of a child, to the voice of someone who had too much to drink? How did he get the American blackface in there so that there would be a dialogue between the American black and the American white? How did he get all these voices, and how did he get so much humor? He was a very funny man, and humor is something I think is important to poetry as well. And then Lowell, because of the Boston Brahmin. Lowell, I think also because as a young man he had become a Catholic convert during the 1940s and had written some of the most extraordinary poetry as a Catholic CO who had spent a year in prison for refusing to serve during the war because of what his reasons were. The bombing of civilian populations in Germany. He thought, we're in a way we're as bad as the Germans are if we're going to bomb German cities. So that's why he spent, and he served the time. Also because Lowell had captured something with the American idiom in a kind of free verse in life studies. And then from there, it was on to Hart Crane, because I wanted to go back to something of the sense of how do you write the Vedic? How do you write the prophetic voice in American poetry? Here's a guy from Ohio, comes to New York, falls in love with the American landscape, the Brooklyn Bridge, etc. Is also an alcoholic, so that he's in one sense he's a joke looked at from the outside, but he's also a serious prophet. And the other thing about them all is that they were all influenced by Hopkins. And I wanted to see how they had been influenced by Hopkins as well. And then I wanted to come back to Gerard Manley Hopkins again. And I wanted to come from the inside this time. I wanted to come in and see him as a Jesuit priest, because most of the writing about Hopkins had seen the fact that he was a Jesuit as almost extraneous. And it's not extraneous, it's absolutely central. Really, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola is what shaped him. Now, I've had very good reviews on the Williams. The only place that I've run into difficulty is in the New York Review of Books with a fellow named Mark Ford, who's angry with me, I think, because I didn't make Hopkins more of a gay poet. Now, Hopkins did in fact have a homosexual proclivity, but he never acted on it. He was a Jesuit, he was a celibate. And this particular critic was angry with me because he wanted to read Hopkins, that is for example, where if he's in a line like in the Wreck of the Deutschland, "Thou mastering me, God, giver of breath and bread," I want to read that as Hopkins' submission to the idea of God. He wanted to read it as the male dominatrix, which is not how I read it. So there was a difference there. But I did stay with my guns. I made the 30-day retreat, by the way. I made it up in Gloucester so that I could understand from the inside what it was that Hopkins had gone through. And believe me, it made all the difference in the world. I'd been teaching Hopkins for 20 years when I made that 30 days. It made all the difference to be able to understand it now through the imagination of Ignatius Loyola. And I wanted to bring that to bear so that you could read the poems in the context in which I think Hopkins would have wanted them read, that is, as a Jesuit priest primarily, and as a Catholic convert. Did he see a sensual indulgence in poetry? And I think the answer to that is yes. Also, he had that fiery conversion experience. He had been an Anglican, a serious Anglican. His whole family were in the Anglican Church. And here he becomes following Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman. He first moves over to the Catholic faith, and within 2 years he becomes a Jesuit joins the Jesuit order. And for him, there's a very strong, almost Miltonic Puritan sense in him. In other words, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to give it 100%. And so he sees, and I think, I don't agree with him, but he sees the need then to destroy all of his poetic output. Now, we're lucky because he had sent copies to other poets, etc. So we have most of he also kept a little journal that he kept. So it was more of a symbolic burning. But he did pretty much not write poetry for the first 7 years as a Jesuit. But he was a poet. So what do you do with that? He was an artist. He wanted to be a painter also, and he gave that up. He said, because it's dangerous. Now, what does he mean by dangerous? He knew that he was very much taken by sensuality. I mean, there's one point, for example, where I mean, he loves nature. He loves it deeply, and he's continually looking at it to see, in fact, if he can find God's fingerprint or God's presence in nature. At one point, because he talks too much at a dinner, he gives up, for a penance, for 6 months, he says, I'm not going to look at anything. I mean, that's that ascetic side. So there's this very strong pull between Hopkins as a sensual man, a sensuous man, a man for whom the world is something to be celebrated, but also the danger. He talks about this even in his 40s. To what serves mortal beauty? What is the purpose of mortal beauty? Because he had seen one of his closest friends who had become a convert with him, become a Catholic priest, but then had his own congregation, Catholic congregation, right there in London, the south part of London. And then what the priest does, is he takes up with one of the parishioners. And Hopkins says, look, marriage is wonderful, but he said, for a priest to do this, you've taken a vow of celibacy. He said, you have to meet beauty. You have to look at it. It is beautiful, but you have to leave it. You have to let it go. You're not God. You can't have it, especially if you've made a vow to give it up. So he kept his vows all of his life, and there was always this tension. Another story. He goes to see a friend of his in Ireland, in Dublin, and he knows when he gets there, because it's a long walk, that the Irish gentleman, who's a lawyer, is going to give him a nice big glass of champagne. So he's waiting to get there, and he says, "Now, am I going to see my friend, or am I going because he's going to give me a glass of champagne?" And he says, "You son of a gun," he says, and he turns around and he walks back home. I mean, that's how tough he could be on himself. If he thought he was doing it for pleasure and the wrong kind of pleasure, he could be very hard on himself. But he also had a great sense of humor, which saved him. And somehow the tension, I think, of the ascesis, plus the tension with just the mortal beauty of things, creates an extraordinary alembic in the imagination, a fire that comes through in everything that he writes. He was deeply attracted to his Anglican roots. He loved, for example, the work of George Herbert, the Anglican priest, and in many ways he reminds me of Herbert. It really came down because he asked himself, why don't I just stay where I am? Because that's what I'm being pretty much told to do by my own Anglican superiors. Why am I doing what Newman did and going over to the Catholic Church? It finally came down to this. I believe that host, that bread, is not a symbol, but is really the presence of Christ. That is a transcendent and transubstantiation. That is a difference between my Anglican faith and the Catholic faith. And it was over that sense of not a symbolic gesture, but a real gesture. That is that the incarnation is a reality, and the incarnation is occurring in every time we have the of the host, the transfiguration of the host. That happens every time. And every time we receive, we're not receiving just a symbol. We are actually ingesting, taking into ourselves God, the God of the universe. It's an extraordinary reality for Hopkins, enough for him to give up becoming a professor at Oxford, staying with the family. He needed to follow this. This was a reality. And boy, he paid the price for it, but he stayed with it. It's funny. All of his life, whenever he would be invited somewhere to stay with his friend Robert Bridges or to stay with his family, often he would not go because he said, the truth is I need to say Mass every single day. That's how important it was to him. And if he couldn't get to a chapel or a church somewhere, then he just wouldn't go to that place. So that's the reality that he stayed with. Sometimes it's brighter, sometimes it's darker. He goes through the dark night of the soul in the year 1884 and 1885. But he always returns with a deeper sense of faith, and it's extraordinary to watch him because anybody who's on the journey can, I think, understand something of what Hopkins is going through. What made Hopkins so distinctive, so different? First of all, you remember that he was trained in the classics at Oxford. So he knew his Greek very, very well. In fact, and he knew his Latin. In fact, he taught these subjects to undergraduates at University College Dublin, the same school that James Joyce would later attend. But But he was also very deeply touched, moved, excited by his Anglo-Saxon roots, his own roots, that sense of getting back to one's own roots, whether that be African-American roots or Irish roots or, whatever. But for him it was the Anglo-Saxon roots. And whenever he could find an English word, he would often cross out the Latinate word and put the English word in there. So that's one thing. So he's trying to recover as much of the Anglo-Saxon tradition as he can to revivify it, because the language by his time, by the second half of the 19th century, had become too Latinate. Say in the work of, say, someone like Tennyson, for example, okay, or Swinburne. So where it was in danger of simply going off into syllables without meaning. So what Hopkins wants to do then is to get back to the roots of the language, number one. Number two, he also realizes that the Anglo-Saxon roots, the nature of the music is different from quantitative verse in either Greek or in Latin. What he wants is to get something of that percussive sound that you hear, say, in Beowulf, that you hear in Langland, say, in a contemporary of Chaucer's, what you hear in the nursery rhymes. And he realizes, look, why should I have a regular da-dum, 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 which becomes kind of mesmerizing after a while and actually drains itself of meaning, when I can use a sharp percussive accent back to back to back. Now, in order to do that, I've got to find a reason, a way of doing that. And so he realizes sprung rhythm. He realizes, okay, what I need here then is not so much unaccented and accented feet. All I really need for a foot is a stress, so that I can literally have 4 or 5 stresses back to back if I need to say it. No, 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 no. Each one of them getting a stress. Not never, 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 never. You see what I mean? But no, 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 no. I can have 5 stresses. On the other hand, I can also have 3 or 4 unstressed syllables if I want to. I caught this morning, morning's minion, kingdom of daylight, dolphin, dappled dawn, drawn, falcon, etc. That kind of thing, you see. So there's a sense in which he wants to remake the language, make it closer to what's happening, say, with Skeets, what's happening with the Oxford, the OED, for example, which is also going on at the same time. He wants to bring back as much of the language as he possibly can, okay? And he wants to get back the music that's been lost over the centuries and get back to, as I say, Beowulf and Langland and others. Also someone like, say, Thomas Wyatt, who was misunderstood. They thought, well, he really didn't know how to make a smooth line. He knew how to make a smooth line. What Wyatt was trying to do, as opposed to Surrey, say, at the beginning of the Renaissance, was to make it stronger, make it like John Donne, to make it closer to the percussiveness, the sound of actual speech. I'd like to talk a little bit about what happens to Hopkins's poetry. He dies in 1889. He's just short of his 45th birthday. He dies of typhus and typhoid because in the slums of Dublin. He's published virtually nothing in his own lifetime. The poems are in the hands of his closest friend, Robert Bridges. He had gone to Oxford University with Bridges, but Bridges, number one, is an agnostic, and number two, hates Jesuits. Okay, it's just funny that he's the man who should have all of Hopkins's poems in his safe for 30 years. Now, to give Bridges credit, he did try to publish a piece here and there of Hopkins's, and every time he did, he was met with a kind of balking, a kind of, what is this? What is this? This isn't poetry, etc. Finally, in 1918, almost 30 years after Hopkins died, 30 years, Bridges, who is now the Poet Laureate of England, finally, in the last year of World War I, 1918, thinks the time is ready, the time is ripe to finally publish in a small edition of 750 copies Hopkins's poems. It took 10 years to sell 750 copies, okay? I think that most of the people of Bridges' generation just couldn't hear Hopkins. They didn't know what he was doing. Even Bridges didn't get it very often, because when he tried to imitate Hopkins' sprung rhythm, Hopkins would say, you don't get it, Robert. You don't get it. Try something else, But, nice try, but you really don't understand what's going on here. Because, you see, it's more than just a technique. It's really a vision. It's a way of looking into the nature of reality, mimetically, to make the things alive to you, present. That's one of the extraordinary things about the sense of verbness, of action that you get in Hopkins's poetry, in line after line after line, poem after poem after poem. Now, there are a handful of people, including one or two Jesuits, who did know that they had something special in Hopkins, but the editors of the month, which was the Jesuit magazine, rejected, including the editor whose name is Father Coleridge, who was a great-grandnephew of S.T. Coleridge. They didn't understand it. They just didn't get it, so they didn't publish it. He tried one more time in the simplified version with another shipwreck poem, The Loss of the Eurydice, a couple of years later, and they rejected that. And then he said, well, if my own community can't get me, maybe then I'm not going to try to publish. But he said, later he told Bridges, he said, if after I'm gone, if somehow the poetry's there, and if God willing, somehow it might get out there. Well, it's almost a miracle that it got out there, but it did get out there. And it's funny, it's only the younger generation. It's the generation of W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender. They're at Cambridge, and they read this, and they say, whoa, this is... Another one is Hart Crane, 1926, Ivor Winters, out in Pasadena, California, says, hey, Hart, you'd like to look at some of these poems. And Crane is so taken by them. He knows there's something so special about these that he literally begins to write them down in longhand because he can't get to there are no Xerox machines. And he writes back to his friend in New York, he says, I will pay a month's rent if you can get this book. That's how much I want this book. So there are people, in the 30s, young Elizabeth Bishop picks them up. As I say, Auden, Spender. By the 1940s, Robert Lowell is so much taken by Hopkins that he writes an essay called Hopkins' Sanctity, not Hopkins' poetry, Hopkins' sanctity, and becomes a convert in large part because he reads Hopkins. Later it will be John Berryman who will do the same thing, who will return to the church because of Hopkins' model. And by the time, by say 1950s, and the close readings, you're finally getting an audience that are picking up Hopkins. So much so that this is what my friend Ron Hansen told me. He's written a terrific book called Exiles about the wreck of the Deutschland. It's a novel. He said, Paul, for the last 30 or 40 years, whenever they ask people in general for the 10 top poems that they admire, Hopkins always gets on there from 1 to 3 times. That's all the poetry, including, Shakespeare, Dryden, Chaucer, etc. Hopkins always gets at least 1 and sometimes as many as 3 poems on that list. So he's had a profound impact, and he continues to have this impact. I don't see any lessening of it. The Jesuits didn't know quite what to do with Father Hopkins. At first they thought, well, here he is. He graduated from Oxford with a double first, at the top of his class. What do we do with him? So they try him as for a while they try him as a special preacher in Farm Street, which is like the church to get into, in London. It doesn't work out. They send him, well, maybe in Oxford he'll do well, but there's already a split between the town and the gown, and so he's looked at with suspicion because he is what they call, what the Anglican, often in the Anglican community, called someone who converted, they call them perverts. Okay, so he has a difficulty with his own, his own group there that he knew, although he does see Walter Pater and others. Finally, then they sent him into the slums, pretty much, Manchester and places like that, and Liverpool, which almost kills him, okay? And they realize he maybe just doesn't have the kind of tough stamina, for slum work, So finally, the Jesuits are taking over Newman's, Cardinal Newman's old school and church in Dublin, which had the idea of a university. Newman was thinking of that school to get for Ireland and for the Irish Catholic population something equivalent to Cambridge and Oxford. Okay, and it failed. It was a noble experiment, but it failed. Part of it was Irish-English relationships, and they were strained, and they would continue to become even more strained following the potato, the famine, etc. And then, of course, the rise of the middle class, the Irish middle class, and also the one class that Hopkins felt closest to would have been the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, Catholic and Protestant. He felt closest to them because of his own background, etc. Judge O'Hagan and people of that, lawyers, etc. He did not feel very, as far from what we can tell, did not feel very close to, say, those who ran the pubs and things of that nature, okay? And he also was the only Englishman, the only English Jesuit in Ireland, the only one. And they sent him because they thought, the English sent him because they thought he was expendable. That's why he got, he was given a shot to go to Dublin. And his job was to teach classics. And it was hard for him. He did not want to go. He really did not want to. He loved England. I mean, he was 110% patriot. But, you know, it was, as hard as it was also good for him. Within a year of his getting there, he realized that you had to be at ground zero, as it were, to realize that the Irish had legitimate complaints. And he said, you know, they must get a home rule. At that time, it wasn't a question of independence. It was a question of home rule with Parnell. He said, you've got to give the Irish, you've got to be here. And, of course, his own friends are saying, what are you talking about? He said, you've got to be there to see how deep the wounds go, how deep the scars go. So he did change in that way. But he was held in suspicion by many of the Irish, and including some of the Irish Jesuits. He was close, as I say, to a certain figures of the Anglo-Irish professional class, but they were quickly leaving. They were going to London, and they were going to the outskirts, to Ballsbridge and places like that. And on top of that, he was fatigued with the work that they gave him. Now, this is hard for someone else to understand. They'd say, well, you know, so what? So you have to grade several thousand papers in Greek and Latin. You know, there are people that have to do that kind of work, you know, et cetera. Well, it was extremely hard because he realized that if he gave a grade, say, of a 74 instead of a 75, it meant that some young Irishman, say from Cork or Galway, might not be able to go to university. And so he kept going over it. I'll give him a half a point for this. I'll give him an eighth of a point for this. And it just added up and added up and added up. He has what they call the Dublin Black Book, in which you can see all these marks, you know, et cetera. And then you also see a poem next to it, that kind, or you'll see a prayer next to it. Anything and everything got in there. But it was grueling work. It was killing work. Now, I also think that he was also just ill with diseases which were sapping his strength. And I don't think they realized that because there was no name for what he had until the 1930s. So he had migraines. He would be up until 2 or 3 in the morning and then up again at 6. He was not a particularly effective teacher, and I think that a lot of the young Irishmen were hard on him. You know what I mean? Can you imagine James Joyce being in a class? If you just read Portrait of the Artist, you know what you're up against, right? And so he's looked at with suspicion. And he also says that there were times when there were protests against, say, some of the English crown coming to Ireland, coming to Dublin, where the students who were spearheading that were his students. So there are all of these, there are all of these difficulties. And then, of course, then the typhoid hit him when he was 44. Why am I taking on Stevens now when I should be thinking of retirement? I've wanted to do Stevens full. It's really, I've known for years pretty much in my own mind, following my teacher Alan Mandelbaum, who taught me Dante. You know, you do the Inferno, you do the Purgatorio, then you do the kind of Paradiso. And for me, the Paradiso was Hopkins. But I find Wallace Stevens an incredibly fascinating man and poet. Stevens is difficult. I think everybody will agree that he's a difficult poet, but he's an incredibly funny man at the same time. I find him funny. I find him deeply emotional, even though he says, am I just a skeleton? No, he's not just a skeleton. He's a man with deep desires and deep love. But I think the big thing that draws me again and again to Stevens is that he's asking the big questions, the profound questions, the existential questions, the metaphysical questions, the ontological questions, the epistemological questions. And he's looking for God. Now, I know that there are some out there who will say, no, he's not looking for God. He knows that there is. No, I don't. I think whatever, you call it whatever you want. Call it the auroras of autumn. Call it the mystery. But there's something big that Stevens has to get on top of it. He has to find a language, a modern language, which can somehow negotiate with those incredible complex oscillations of reality. Okay, and that's what I'm fascinated with. It's interesting. The very end of his life, Stevens wound up with cancer, and he wound up in St. Francis Hospital, which is about halfway between where his office was. That is, he worked until he could no longer work, and his home on Waverly Place. And there's this Franciscan hospital, St. Francis, and he asked, and it's proven, although his daughter and his wife said no to this, he asked for the sacraments. He asked to become a convert. Now, what does that mean? Now, you take some critics like Helen Vendel and say it doesn't matter because he was close to death. Well, or on the other hand, was it in fact the omega point? And I don't have the answer to this, but I'm fascinated by the progress, by the sense of where he's going with all of this. So, and he's very philosophical, and I find my own poetry. By the way, in each case, I've learned a great deal from each of these poets, and right now, Stevens deeply appeals to me in terms of that kind of oscillating language. So I want to spend these years now researching the life and also learning what I can for my own poetry from Wallace Stevens.